The studies, there are a handful of studies that CDC has generated on autism. They were all epidemiological studies. And they all say what the CDC wanted them to say is they couldn't find a link. The problem is that the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, had said in 2001 that the link between autism and vaccine is biologically plausible. And they were highly critical of the way that CDC was making decisions about the vaccine schedule, that it was, this group ACIP, which is an external panel, which has the responsibility of deciding which new vaccines will be added to the schedule, that they had essentially been captured by industry. The people who serve on that panel, almost all of them have financial entanglements with the industry. And the Institute of Medicine recommended a litany, a retinue of studies, including animal models, observational studies, bench studies, and epidemiological studies. They said, you need this whole retinue to answer this question. The CDC never did those. Instead, it commissioned the creation of these 6 epidemiological studies, and none of them does what all of them were. They use fraudulent techniques. They say statistics don't lie, but statisticians do. And epidemiological studies are very easy to manipulate. None of those studies did what you would do if you wanted to find the answer, which is to compare outcomes in a fully vaccinated group to health outcomes in an unvaccinated group. And CDC did that study in 1999. They brought in a team of scientists under a Belgian researcher named Thomas Verstraeten, and they looked at the data. They looked at children who had received the hepatitis vaccine within the first 30 days of life, and compared those children to children who had received the vaccine later or not at all. And they found an 1,135% elevated risk of autism among the vaccinated children. And it shocked them. They kept the study secret, and then they manipulated it through 5 different iterations to try to bury the link. And, we know how they did it. They got rid of all the older children, essentially, and just had younger children who were too young to be diagnosed. And they stratified the data, and they did a lot of other tricks. And all of those studies were the subject of that kind of trickery. And so what we're going to do now, and meanwhile, the external literature is showing, over 100 studies that show that indicate that there is a link. But what we're going to do now is we're going to do all the kind of studies that the Institute of Medicine originally recommended. And we're going to do observational studies, retrospective studies, and epidemiological studies. We're going to do real science. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to make the databases public for the first time. We've gone into CDC. We've gotten the data from CMS, which is Medicaid and Medicare. We're getting the data from the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is the biggest repository for HMO health records. So those records would have all the records of vaccination and then the subsequent health claims. And you can do a cluster analysis and see if there's an association. And we're going to do some in-house studies ourselves, but more importantly, we're going to make this data available for independent scientists so everybody can look at it. And then we have already put out grant requests to the general scientific community so that any scientist with credentials can apply for a grant and tell us how they want to go about studying these. And we're going to get real studies done for the first time. And we should have some answers by September, some initial indicator answers. And then it'll take over the next 6 months all these large studies by independent scientists all over the world. We anticipate there'll probably be about 15 different major teams who are all trying to answer this question. And within 6 months, we'll have definitive answers after September.
And is it your expectation that those answers will differ from kind of status quo understanding?
I think they will. My opinion, I always tell people, is irrelevant. People, we need to stop trusting the experts, right? We were told at the beginning of COVID, don't look at any data yourself, don't do any investigation yourself, just trust the experts. And trusting the experts is not a feature of science. It's not a feature of democracy. It's a feature of religion, and it's a feature of totalitarianism. In democracies, we have the obligation, and it's one of the burdens of citizenship, to do our own research and make our own determinations about things. Mothers, when they go shopping, they don't trust the advertising. A good mother does not trust the advertising. They don't trust what they hear. They do their own research, and it's a much harder way to live. But, that is one of the burdens of living in a democracy, is that we do our own research, we make up our own minds, and that's the way it should be done. And we're going to give people gold standard science. We're going to publish our protocols in advance. We're going to tell people what we're doing, and then we're going to use data, and we're going to publish the peer reviews, which is never published by CDC studies. We're going to publish anytime that we can the raw data, and then we're going to allow, and then we're going to require replication of every study, which never happens in NIH now. That's something new that we're bringing in, is that every study will be replicated.
I thought that was like a basic precept of science. We can't know something unless the experiment showing it can be replicated, right?
Yeah, that is a basic precept of science, and unfortunately, it has the kind of science that was done by NIH. And NIH was the gold standard agency when I was a kid. But they stopped doing that, and it incentivized a lot of cheating. And the reason it incentivizes cheating is that if you're a scientist, your career depends on how much you publish. And so if you have a hypothesis and you say, this is my hypothesis, this is the study that I want to do, and you get a grant from NIH, and the hypothesis turns out to be wrong, it doesn't, the science does not support it. A lot of times you cannot get that study published. That's science. It's science when a null hypothesis is science, and it ought to be published, but the journals won't do it. And also the journals won't publish anything that is critical of vaccines. So they won't do it because there's so much pressure on them. They're funded by the pharmaceutical companies, and they'll lose advertising. They'll lose revenue from reprints if they don't do that. So even Marcia Engel, who was the long time, I think 25 years at the New England Journal of Medicine, she said, you can't believe anything that's in the scientific journals anymore. Richard Horton, who's the longtime editor of The Lancet, is the same thing. He says, we've become propaganda vessels for the pharmaceutical companies. And the pharmaceutical company, now you have to pay to get something published in these journals. And so the pharmaceutical companies pay for something. They give they hire these mercenary scientists, we call them biostitutes, to do a study that will validate their product and, say that this statin drug works against heart attacks. And they'll mess with the data because they want it published. They're being paid by the pharmaceutical companies. And then once it's published, the journal will make available preprints. The preprint is a little magazine with the logo of the Lancet on the front. And it has that one article that says this statin drug works or this SSRI works. And then they have tens of thousands of pharmaceutical reps who will take those journal articles and go to every doctor's office in the country and say, and they're usually, let me put it this way, hot-looking women or, and they'll go, right, they'll go take the doctor out to lunch. They'll say, why don't you start prescribing this drug? And they'll incentivize the doctor in all kinds of ways to do that. And so the doctors also have their own incentives, perverse incentives. There's a published article out there now that says that 50% of revenues to most pediatricians come from vaccines. And then there's a whole structure where Blue Cross and the other insurance companies pay bonuses to the pediatrician to make sure if, for example, 95% of if their clients are fully vaccinated, they get huge bonuses. It could be tens of thousands of dollars. And that's why you're a pediatrician. If you say, I want to go slow on the vaccines or I want to have a little different schedule, your pediatrician will throw you out of his practice because you're now jeopardizing that bonus structure. And these are all perverse incentives that stop doctors from actually practicing medicine and caring for the client because they're looking at the bottom line. 20 years ago, 20% of the doctors in this country worked for corporations. Today, 80% do. And that corporation is telling you, we don't care what happens to your patient. We care about how much revenue you're generating. And, these doctors are coming out of medical schools with ginormous bills. And that will bankrupt them if they don't have a job. And so they're under tremendous pressure just to keep generating those funds. And the whole system, as you know, it's just a bundle of perverse incentives that where everybody is making money by keeping us sick, and I'm not saying that's deliberate or purposeful or planned in any way. It's just the incentive system that everybody makes money. The insurance companies make money if you're sick. Ironically, they make more money if the population is sick. And, that may seem counterintuitive to people. And a guy said to me once who worked for AIG, one of the big insurance companies, he said, I said, I want to go with some data to AIG and show them that, what they're doing is actually, I can show them on paper, what they're doing is actually making their people sicker. And they're the one group that you would think would want healthy people because they'd have to pay out less. And this guy said to me, think of it this way. If you're Lloyd's of London and you insure all the shipping in the world, is it better for you if one ship sinks a year or if 500 sink a year? And I said to him, it's better if only one sinks. And he said, no, it's better if 500 sink because then everybody has to get insurance. And what the insurance companies are collecting money is friction. Oh, they're taking a cut of the revenues that come through them. The more people that buy insurance, it doesn't matter what the claims are. If the claims are high, they just raise their premiums. And it's the amount of money that flows in the system that gives them money. So they're making money that way. The doctors are making money from keeping us sick. The hospitals are making money from keeping us sick. The pharmaceutical companies are making money from keeping us sick. Yeah. So every level of the system is incentivized financially, no matter what your intention is as a doctor. If you're a doctor, of course you don't want sick patients. But there's tremendous pressure from every angle of the system to actually, to keep us all sick. And we're now the sickest nation in the world.
One of the reasons that there hasn't been much of a discussion, you said there were signals in 1999 that there was a connection between autism and vaccines. The response from the American media was just to throw you out, take away your New York Times presence, ban you from Rolling Stone, et cetera, attack you as a Nazi. You made the point years later that the reason that happened was because pharmaceutical companies are the single biggest source of revenue for a lot of media companies, and they're buying the protection with that money.
And that's another perverse incentive, right?
Absolutely. I think we're one of only 2 countries in the world that allow that. Can that be stopped?
That's a question that we are looking at right now. And there's a bad Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago that gave that essentially anointed pharmaceutical advertising with First Amendment protection. The First Amendment protects political speech. So if you're saying something, political, you should have absolute protection under the First Amendment. If commercial speech has a lower level of protection, and the pharmaceutical advertising was regulated as commercial speech, and it was until 1990, really around 1992. It was you didn't see pharmaceutical advertising. There was no direct-to-consumer advertising on TV, and after that, and then there were more changes made in 1997. That's when it became, it exploded. And today, Roger Ailes, who both you and I knew, I had this very Roger Ailes, for your audience who doesn't know him, which I think most of them do, was the founder of Fox News. And I had this odd relationship with him because politically we were at loggerheads, but I had spent, when I was 19 years old, I spent 3 months with him in a tent in Africa. And we developed a friendship then. And as you know, he was a very engaging guy. He was very witty, really fun to be with. Very paranoid, but at the same time, brilliant.
Yes.
And so he was very kind to me. He was a very loyal friend to me, and he would make Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly and Neil Cavuto and all of the other hosts, who your former colleagues, put me on TV to talk about the environment. Even though he didn't agree with me on it, he made them put me on. So during the 80s and 90s, I was the only environmentalist who was going on Fox News. But I brought him one time around, I think it was like 2014, I brought him a documentary that we had done about mercury and vaccines. And he watched it. He was completely sold on it. He had a family member who had been affected, he felt. And he said, but I can't put you on because if I did, if any of my hosts allowed you on to talk about this issue, I would have to fire them. And if I didn't, I would get a call from Rupert within 10 minutes. And he said, for the evening news division, about 75% of the advertising revenues are coming from pharma. And then he told me something that, if I remember it correctly, he said that on the typical evening news show, there are 22 ads, and 17 of those are pharmaceutical ads. And so this was the principal source of revenue. And for a lot of these television networks, it's keeping them alive. As you know, they're all, kind of collapsing financially.
Yes. Collapsing due to lack of popular demand for their presence.
Right.
So could you end that? Do you have the authority as the Secretary of Health and Human Services to say no more pharma ads on television?
Well, a lot of the pharmaceutical ads are misleading.
Yeah.
And even the music and the video, the photos, that they show, the scenes that they show that's kind of speech, and it's misleading. It's sending a message. And if you take this drug, you're going to be riding jet skis and playing volleyball and water skiing and
have a great looking spouse,
right?
Happy kids.
The side effects, meanwhile, are rolling, at 80 miles an hour, and that's misleading. And so one of the things that we, that we're looking at is making them be more honest about what they show, so that the public is, this pharmaceutical advertising is insidious for a number of reasons. That's why they don't allow it anywhere else in the world. New Zealand has a very, very limited allowance of direct-to-consumer advertising, very, very highly controlled. Compared to us, it's nothing. People who come over here from England or Europe and watch our TV are shocked by what they're seeing on it. And it's insidious because of this. The pharmaceutical advertisers are advertising the most expensive version of every drug. They're not going to advertise the generics because they're not making any money. So they're advertising the ones that are the highest profit margins for them. And normally, if you see an advertisement on TV, like for Coca-Cola, you then have a choice to go get that, and then you're paying out of your pocket for it. When somebody buys a pharmaceutical drug, it's Medicaid and Medicare that are paying for it. With us, it's the taxpayer. So they're advertising something to the consumer when the consumer has no skin in the game. And then the consumer, and we're paying for the ads because they're tax deductible. So we're paying for them to advertise, and the advertisements are getting people to buy drugs that may be ineffective, that may be the least effective drug of the ones that are available. And they go to their physician. The physician is told by his boss, who's the corporate bean counter, you have 11 minutes with each patient, and that's it. And the physician then can spend that 11 minutes trying to talk the patient out of something that they want, and then the patient's going to go away unsatisfied. Or the physician could just say, all right, you want this prescription, I'll write it for you. And then, that patient is then going to come back because he's happy. The doctors hate it. The American Medical Association has been against it for 30 years. And nobody thinks that this is good for public health. It is hurting us, and it's distorting the markets, and it's not, you can't even call it a free market because everything's paid for by the federal government.
So starting in September, when we start to see the results of the analysis of these massive data sets that you're putting out there in public, and if it becomes clear that there is a connection between autism and vaccines the government promoted, in some cases effectively required, that's a tort. I mean, that means there are a lot of injured people who can now show they were injured by this product. How are they made whole? What happens to them?
Well, that's going to be complicated because in 1986, Congress passed an act, the Vaccine Act, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and they gave the vaccine companies immunity from liability. So no matter how reckless the company is, no matter how toxic the product, no matter how egregious your injury, you cannot sue them. And that's one of the problems. And that actually is why one of the reasons we had this explosion in the vaccination program. When I was a kid, we only had 3 vaccines. And by 1986, the year the act was passed, there were 11 doses of, I think, 5 vaccines. And today there are a child to go to school in states like California and New York and many other states where you have mandates. An American child now has to receive between 69 and 92 vaccines between conception, so some of those are given to the mom during pregnancy, and age 18. And the reason it's 69 to 82 is some of the vaccines the different brands have different dose requirements. So some will require 3 doses, some will require 1 dose, some will require 4 doses. But that's a lot of vaccines for a kid. And each one of those is calculated, is designed to permanently alter your immune system. And so we have now this epidemic of immune dysregulation in our country, and there's no way to rule out vaccines is one of the key culprits. And if you look at all of these diseases that have become epidemic, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, all of these seizure disorders, the neurological disorders like ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism, all the diseases you and I never saw when we were kids.
No.
And suddenly this generation is damaged, is incredibly damaged by all these diseases. The autoimmune diseases like diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, the allergic diseases like peanut allergies, anaphylaxis, eczema. Did you ever know anybody with eczema?
No.
Right. So, and now it's ubiquitous in every classroom. And all of those injuries are listed as side effects on the manufacturer's inserts of those products. So we would have to be blind to not say we have to look at this as a potential culprit. We have to do the studies that the Institute of Medicine has been telling the CDC to do for 25 years. The Institute of Medicine told CDC in 2013 there are 158 injuries that are suspected to be vaccine injuries. Only 38 of those have been studied, and almost most of those, it was positive. It was, yeah, this is a vaccine injury. The other 120, whatever, and I'm not doing the math in my head, but the others have never been studied. The CDC's job is to study them, and yet it never studied them. And that was purposeful. And I'm not saying that out of speculation. I'm saying that because I've seen the emails. And CDC deliberately derailed any study on that. And if somebody independent scientist does do a study, they can't get it published. The scientific publishers will not publish a study that is critical of vaccines. So we need to change that taboo. And that's one of the things Jay Bhattacharya is doing at NIH, is we're going to remove the taboo about talking about this issue. And we're going to be honest with the American public.